I watched through my kitchen window as the 6-foot cedar fence crew hammered in the final post, and I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that my backyard would finally have the privacy I had been craving for the past 3 years. The property I owned in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, had been a dream come true when I bought it 5 years ago, but the constant feeling of being watched by my neighbors had worn me down. My name is Quincy Morrison, and I am a software engineer who works from home most days, which means I spend a lot of time in my backyard trying to decompress from the stress of debugging code and attending virtual meetings. The fence was a solid investment, professionally installed, and positioned exactly 2 feet inside my property line according to the survey I had commissioned just last month. The foreman walked over to me, wiping sweat from his brow despite the relatively cool November morning. "All done, Mr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand for a shake. "That is some quality cedar right there. Should last you 20 years easy with minimal maintenance." I thanked him, signed off on the work order, and watched as the crew loaded up their equipment and drove away. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually enjoy my backyard without feeling like I was performing for an audience. That peaceful feeling lasted exactly 47 minutes. I was sitting on my new patio furniture, sipping coffee and enjoying the view of the fence that blocked out my neighbor's constant surveillance, when I heard the clicking of heels on my driveway. I recognized that sound. It was Patricia Hendricks, the president of our Homeowners Association, and she always wore those ridiculous kitten heels even when she was just walking around the neighborhood looking for violations. She was in her early 50s, had that specific haircut that seemed to be issued along with HOA board positions, and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Quincy Morrison," she called out before she even reached my backyard gate. "We need to discuss your new fence immediately." I set down my coffee and walked over to meet her at the gate, already feeling my blood pressure rising. Patricia had been a thorn in my side since I moved into this neighborhood. She had cited me for having my trash cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours, for planting flowers that were not on the approved color list, and for parking my work van in my own driveway because it had a small company logo on the side. "Hello, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice level. "What seems to be the problem?" She pursed her lips and tapped her pen against her clipboard in that annoying way she always did when she was about to deliver bad news. "Your fence is the problem, Quincy. I have already received a complaint about it, and I have to say I agree with the complaint. That fence is completely unacceptable." I felt my jaw clench. "Unacceptable how exactly? I had the property surveyed. The fence is 2 feet inside my property line. I checked the HOA covenants, and there is nothing prohibiting a 6-foot privacy fence made of cedar. I followed every rule." Patricia shook her head like I was a child who did not understand basic concepts. "The issue is not the legality of the fence itself, Quincy. The issue is that your fence blocks Karen Whitmore's view of the mountains. She has lived in the house behind you for 12 years, and she has always had a beautiful view of Camelback Mountain from her back patio. Your fence has completely destroyed that view." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what she had just said. "Karen Whitmore's view," I repeated slowly. "The view from her property looking across my property is somehow my responsibility." Patricia nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Karen is a valued member of this community, Quincy. She serves on the Architectural Review Committee and has contributed countless volunteer hours to neighborhood beautification. The least you could do is be considerate of her enjoyment of her property." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "Patricia, with all due respect, Karen Whitmore does not have any legal right to a view across my property. I checked with a real estate attorney before I had this fence installed. View easements are not automatic. They have to be specifically established and recorded in property deeds. Karen has no view easement. She has no legal claim to any view that crosses my property. Patricia's face turned red, which was never a good sign. This is not about legalities, Quincy. This is about being a good neighbor and being part of a community. The HOA exists to maintain property values and quality of life for all residents. Your fence damages Karen's quality of life, and therefore it needs to come down. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You want me to tear down a fence that I just paid $8,000 to install, a fence that is completely legal and within all HOA rules, because it blocks a view that Karen has no legal right to? Yes, Patricia said firmly. That is exactly what I am saying. I am giving you until next Friday to remove the fence. If you do not comply, the HOA will begin fining you $50 per day until the fence is removed. She turned on her heel and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in my backyard, staring at the fence that had cost me a small fortune and wondering how my life had turned into a bad sitcom. I immediately called my attorney, Robert Chen, who had helped me review the HOA covenants before I built the fence. He listened to my story and then let out a long sigh. Quincy, I am going to be straight with you. The HOA does not have any legal standing here. You followed all the rules. But HOAs can make your life miserable even when they are wrong. My advice is to respond in writing. Cite the specific sections of the covenants that allow your fence, and make it clear that you will not be removing it. Also, request in writing any documentation of a view easement that Karen Whitmore claims to have. I spent that evening drafting a detailed letter to the HOA board. I cited Section 7.3 of the covenants, which explicitly allowed privacy fences up to 6 feet in height as long as they were made of approved materials, and set back at least 1 foot from property lines. I pointed out that cedar was on the approved materials list. I requested copies of any recorded view easements affecting my property. I also made it clear that I would not be removing the fence, and that any fines imposed would be challenged in court. The next morning, I hand-delivered the letter to Patricia's house and sent copies via certified mail to all board members. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I found a notice taped to my front door. It was an official violation notice from the HOA, stating that my fence violated the community harmony provision of the covenants, and that I had 7 days to remove it or face daily fines of $50. I read the notice 3 times, getting angrier with each reading. The community harmony provision was one of those vague catch-all clauses that HOAs love to include so they could enforce their petty whims. It stated that no homeowner could maintain any structure or condition that materially interfered with the peaceful enjoyment and community harmony of the neighborhood. It was the kind of language that could mean anything or nothing, depending on who was interpreting it. I called Robert again. They are trying to use the community harmony clause, I told him. Can they do that? He was quiet for a moment. They can try. But that clause is almost impossible to enforce for something like a fence that meets all the other requirements. You would need to show actual harm, not just someone being upset that they cannot see mountains that are not on their property. Here is what I recommend. Send another letter stating that you dispute the violation, request a formal hearing before the board, and start documenting everything. Take photos. Keep copies of all correspondence, everything. I followed his advice. I sent a letter disputing the violation and requesting a hearing. I also decided to do something else. I went door to door to my other neighbors, explaining the situation and asking if they had any problem with my fence. I talked to 15 households over the course of 2 days. Every single one of them said they had no issue with my fence. Several of them said they thought it looked nice. 3 of them mentioned that they had been considering installing similar fences themselves, but had been afraid of HOA pushback. One neighbor, an elderly man named George Patterson who lived 2 houses down, told me something interesting. "You know, Quincy, Karen Whitmore tried to get me to cut down a tree in my front yard about 5 years ago, said it blocked her view when she drove down the street. I told her where she could stick that complaint. Patricia backed her up, of course. Those two are thick as thieves. I think Karen's sister-in-law is on the board too. It is a whole little power structure they have got going." That information was enlightening. I started doing some research into the HOA board composition. Sure enough, Karen Whitmore's sister-in-law, Deborah Whitmore Sanders, was the secretary of the board. Patricia Hendricks and Karen had been neighbors before Patricia moved to a different street in the same neighborhood, and they were clearly close friends. The treasurer was a man named Douglas Kern, who seemed to just go along with whatever Patricia wanted. The only board member who seemed potentially reasonable was Marcus Thompson, who had only been on the board for 6 months. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, on a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock in the community clubhouse. I spent those 3 weeks preparing my case like I was going to trial. I gathered copies of the property survey, photographs of the fence showing it was 2 feet inside my property line, printouts of the relevant sections of the HOA covenants, research on view easements and Arizona property law, and written statements from neighbors saying they had no problem with the fence. The night of the hearing, I arrived at the clubhouse 15 minutes early. The room was set up like a small courtroom, with a table at the front for the board members and chairs arranged in rows for residents. I was surprised to see that about 20 people were already there. Apparently, word had spread about the hearing, and people were interested in the outcome. Patricia sat in the center of the board table, with Deborah to her right and Douglas to her left. Marcus sat at the end, looking uncomfortable. Karen Whitmore sat in the front row, wearing a smug expression that made me want to throw something. The hearing started exactly at 7. Patricia banged a gavel, which seemed overly dramatic for a neighborhood HOA meeting, and called the proceeding to order. "We are here tonight to address the fence violation at 4782 Saguaro Ridge Drive, the property of Quincy Morrison," Patricia announced. "Mr. Morrison has requested a hearing to dispute the violation notice. Mr. Morrison, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, carrying my folder of documentation. "Thank you for the opportunity to address the board," I began. 3 weeks ago, I installed a 6-foot cedar privacy fence in my backyard. The fence is positioned 2 feet inside my property line, as confirmed by a licensed surveyor. The fence is made of cedar, which is an approved material under Section 5.2 of the HOA covenants. The fence is 6 feet tall, which is within the maximum height allowed under Section 7.3 of the covenants. In every measurable way, my fence complies with the HOA rules. I distributed copies of the survey and the relevant covenant sections to the board members. Despite full compliance with all written rules, I received a violation notice stating that my fence violates the community harmony provision. The basis for this violation appears to be a complaint from Karen Whitmore, who claims that my fence blocks her view of Camelback Mountain. I want to be very clear about the legal facts here. Karen Whitmore does not have a view easement. There is no recorded easement of any kind affecting my property that would grant anyone a right to a view across my land. A view easement must be explicitly created and recorded. It does not exist simply because someone has enjoyed a view in the past. I saw Karen's face turning red in the front row. I continued, I have also gathered statements from 15 other households in this neighborhood, all of whom state that they have no problem with my fence and do not believe it affects community harmony in any way. Several neighbors have expressed interest in installing similar fences. The only person who has complained is Miss Whitmore, who is upset that she can no longer see mountains that exist on public land through a view corridor that crosses my private property. Her disappointment, while understandable, does not create a legal obligation on my part. Patricia interrupted me. Mr. Morrison, this is not a court of law. We are not here to discuss legal technicalities. We are here to discuss what is best for the community. I turned to face her directly. With respect, Patricia, we absolutely are here to discuss whether the HOA has the authority to force me to remove a fence that complies with all written rules. If the answer is that the Community Harmony Clause can be used to override any other rule whenever the board feels like it, then the HOA covenants are essentially meaningless. Any homeowner could be cited for any reason at any time based on the subjective feelings of board members or their friends. Marcus Thompson, the newer board member, spoke up for the first time. Mr. Morrison makes a valid point. I have reviewed the covenants myself, and I do not see how we can enforce a violation when the fence clearly meets all the specific requirements. The Community Harmony Clause is meant for things like excessive noise or genuinely disruptive behavior, not for legal structures that someone simply does not like aesthetically. Patricia shot Marcus a look that could have melted steel. The board has the discretion to interpret the covenants as we see fit. That discretion is clearly established in Section 12.1. Deborah nodded vigorously. I agree with Patricia. Mr. Morrison is being deliberately obstinate and unneighborly. If he cared about this community, he would work with Miss Whitmore to find a solution. I felt my frustration boiling over. What solution would that be exactly? Should I cut my fence in half so it only provides partial privacy? Should I install a fence made of transparent material that defeats the entire purpose of having a privacy fence? Or should I just do whatever Karen Whitmore demands because she has connections on the board? Karen herself stood up at that point. How dare you? She shouted. I have been a part of this community for 12 years. I have given my time and energy to making this neighborhood beautiful, and you come in here with your ugly fence and destroy everything I have worked for. I turned to face her. Your view of the mountains is not something you worked for, Karen. It is something you enjoyed because my property happened to be in the sight line, and the previous owner chose not to install a fence. I have the same right to privacy on my property that you have on yours. If you want a guaranteed view of the mountains, you should have bought property that directly faces them, not property that requires looking across someone else's land. The room erupted in noise. Several people were talking at once. Patricia banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the room finally quieted down, she spoke in an icy tone. Mr. Morrison, you have made your position clear. The board will now deliberate and vote on whether the violation stands. Please wait outside while we discuss. I walked out of the clubhouse and stood in the parking lot, trying to calm down. A few of the neighbors who had given me statements came out and expressed their support. George Patterson clapped me on the shoulder. You gave them hell in there, Quincy. About time someone stood up to Patricia and her cronies. After about 20 minutes, I was called back inside. The board members were seated again, all looking grim. Patricia cleared her throat. The board has voted on whether the violation notice stands. The vote is 3-1 in favor of upholding the violation. You have 7 days from tonight to remove the fence, or fines of $50 per day will begin accruing. I had expected this result, but it still made me angry. For the record, who voted against upholding the violation? Patricia hesitated, then said, Marcus Thompson voted against. The vote of individual board members is typically kept confidential, but since you asked directly in a public hearing, I am answering. I nodded. Thank you for that honesty, at least. I want to state clearly for the record that I will not be removing the fence. I will be challenging any fines imposed, and if necessary, I will pursue legal action against the HOA for improper enforcement of the covenants. You are setting a precedent here that will allow the board to override any written rule based on personal preferences. That is not how governing documents are supposed to work. Patricia's smile was cold. You are welcome to pursue whatever legal action you feel is appropriate, Mr. Morrison. The board stands by its decision. This hearing is adjourned. I left the clubhouse feeling defeated but also determined. I called Robert Chen the next morning and told him everything that had happened. He listened carefully and then said, Okay, here is where we are. The HOA is going to start fining you. Those fines will add up. Eventually, they can put a lien on your property for unpaid fines. That is their nuclear option. Before it gets to that point, we have a couple of paths we can take. He continued, First, we can file a lawsuit seeking a declaratory judgment that the fence does not violate the covenants and that the HOA is acting beyond its authority. That will be expensive and time-consuming, but you would probably win. Second, we can wait for the fines to accumulate to a significant amount and then challenge them in court when the HOA tries to collect. Third, we can try to negotiate some kind of settlement, though based on what you have told me, that seems unlikely. I thought about it for a moment. How expensive is expensive for the lawsuit? Robert sighed. Probably $15,000 to $20,000 by the time we are done, maybe more if they fight hard. But here is the thing. If we win, which I think we would, we can seek attorney's fees from the HOA. Many states, including Arizona, have laws that allow recovery of attorney's fees in HOA disputes when the HOA is acting unreasonably. I made my decision. Let us file the lawsuit. I am not backing down on this. If I let them bully me into removing a legal fence, what is next? They will have free rein to impose whatever arbitrary rules they want. Robert agreed to start drafting the complaint. In the meantime, the 7-day deadline passed, and the fines began. I received a bill from the HOA for $50, then another one the next day, then another. I kept every bill and did not pay any of them. 2 weeks after the hearing, something interesting happened. I received a call from Marcus Thompson, the board member who had voted against the violation. Mr. Morrison, I hope you do not mind me calling you directly. I got your number from the neighborhood directory. I wanted to let you know that I am planning to resign from the board. I was surprised. Why is that, Marcus? He sounded frustrated. Because I cannot in good conscience be part of what is happening here. Patricia runs that board like her personal fiefdom. She and Karen and Deborah have been friends for years, and Douglas just goes along with whatever they want. I tried to bring up concerns about other issues, proper reserve funding, getting multiple bids for maintenance work, and I get shut down every time. This fence situation is just the most blatant example of them abusing their authority. I thanked him for his honesty and for his vote against the violation. After he hung up, I realized that this situation was probably bigger than just my fence. If Patricia was abusing her authority in other ways, there might be other homeowners who were fed up with her. I decided to do some investigating. Over the next week, I talked to as many neighbors as I could. What I learned was eye-opening. Karen had apparently filed complaints against at least a dozen different homeowners over the years, always for petty issues, and Patricia had backed her up every time. One family had been fined for having their garage door open for more than 2 hours on a Saturday while they were cleaning it out. Another homeowner had been cited for having a wreath on their door that was not a pre-approved holiday decoration. A couple had been threatened with fines because their teenage son's car, which was properly registered and insured, was painted a bright blue that Karen thought was tacky. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Patricia and Karen were running a personal vendetta operation disguised as HOA governance. I started organizing. I created a private Facebook group for neighborhood residents who were frustrated with the HOA board. Within 3 days, 47 people had joined. The stories they shared were infuriating. One woman had been fined because she planted roses instead of the approved petunias. A man had been cited because his house numbers were allegedly too ornate, even though they were well within the size requirements. We started planning. HOA board elections were coming up in 4 months in March. If we could get enough people to run for the board and enough people to vote, we could potentially replace Patricia and her allies. I recruited 3 neighbors to run for board positions. George Patterson, who was retired and had plenty of time to dedicate to it. Susan Ramirez, who was a paralegal and understood governing documents. And Tom Fletcher, who was a financial advisor and could handle the treasurer duties properly. Meanwhile, Robert filed the lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court. The complaint sought a declaratory judgment that my fence did not violate the HOA covenants, an injunction preventing the HOA from fining me for the fence, and attorney's fees. The lawsuit had to be served on the HOA, which meant serving Patricia as the president. I was not there when she was served, but I heard from another neighbor that she turned purple with rage when she received the papers. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney, a man named Richard Bloom. The letter was condescending in tone and stated that I was wasting everyone's time and money with frivolous litigation. It offered a settlement. I could remove the fence, and the HOA would waive the fines that had already accumulated. By this point, the fines totaled about $2,000. I showed the letter to Robert, who laughed. That is not a settlement. That is them demanding you give them everything they want. Let us respond with a counteroffer. Robert drafted a response offering a real settlement. The HOA would acknowledge that the fence did not violate the covenants, all fines would be waived, and the HOA would pay $5,000 toward my attorney's fees. We did not expect them to accept, and they did not. Richard Bloom responded that the HOA would not pay a single penny, and that I should prepare for a lengthy legal battle. As winter turned to early spring, the situation escalated in unexpected ways. Karen Whitmore apparently could not stand seeing my fence every day. I started noticing small acts of vandalism. Someone spray painted a crude insult on my fence in the middle of the night. I filed a police report and installed security cameras. A week later, the cameras caught Karen's husband, a thin, nervous-looking man named Donald, trying to pry off one of my fence boards at 2 in the morning. The camera footage was crystal clear, showing his face and his actions. I called the police and showed them the footage. They went to the Whitmore house and questioned Donald. He admitted to attempting to damage the fence, claiming that his wife had been so upset about it that he thought he could fix the problem. The officer explained to him that vandalism was a crime and that I would be within my rights to press charges. Donald begged me not to, claiming that it would ruin his career. He worked as an accountant for a small firm, and a criminal record would be devastating. I should have pressed charges. Looking back, that was my mistake. Instead, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges if Donald would sign a written statement admitting what he had done and promising not to trespass on my property again. I also insisted that Karen stop her harassment campaign. Donald agreed and signed the statement. I thought that would be the end of it. 2 weeks before the board election, I came home from a grocery run to find that a 6-foot section of my fence had been torn down. The boards were scattered across my yard, and the posts had been sawed off at ground level. I checked my security camera footage and felt my blood run cold. The footage showed Karen herself, wielding a reciprocating saw, cutting down the fence in broad daylight. She had worn sunglasses and a hat, but her face was still clearly visible. She had spent nearly an hour destroying that section of fence, and she had been methodical about it. This time, I did not hesitate. I called the police immediately and showed them the footage. They arrived within 30 minutes, watched the video, and agreed that it clearly showed criminal mischief, which in Arizona is a serious crime when the damage exceeds $1,000. The repair cost for that section of fence was going to be at least $1,500. The officers went to Karen's house and arrested her. I watched from my front window as Karen was led out of her house in handcuffs, screaming about how I had ruined her life and how she was going to sue me for defamation. Patricia arrived at Karen's house about 15 minutes later, and I could see her arguing with the police officers. It did not help. Karen was taken to the station, booked, and charged with criminal mischief in the 2nd degree, a Class 6 felony because the damage exceeded $1,000. The neighborhood exploded with gossip. The Facebook group I had created went wild with speculation and commentary. Some people expressed shock that Karen would go that far. Others said they were not surprised at all and shared stories of her aggressive behavior over the years. Patricia tried to do damage control, sending an email to all residents claiming that Karen had been under tremendous stress and that the situation had been blown out of proportion. The board election took place on a Saturday morning in mid-March. The turnout was massive, far higher than any previous election. Normally, maybe 30% of homeowners bothered to vote in board elections. This time, over 75% voted. The results were a complete repudiation of Patricia and her allies. George Patterson, Susan Ramirez, and Tom Fletcher won 3 of the 4 open board positions by overwhelming margins. Marcus Thompson, who had unresigned and decided to run for re-election after the community support, won the 4th seat. Patricia, Deborah, and Douglas all lost their seats. Patricia's face when the results were announced was something I would never forget. She looked like she had been physically struck. She tried to contest the results, claiming irregularities in the voting process, but the election had been conducted by an independent management company, and everything had been done by the book. She had simply lost because the majority of homeowners were tired of her authoritarian approach. The new board was seated within a week. One of their first official acts was to pass a resolution stating that my fence did not violate any HOA covenants and directing the HOA's attorney to dismiss the legal action against me and settle my lawsuit. Richard Bloom was fired as the HOA's attorney. The new board hired a different law firm, and they reached out to Robert to negotiate a settlement. The settlement was more than fair. The HOA acknowledged that my fence was legal and did not violate any covenants. All fines were waived. The HOA agreed to pay $25,000 toward my attorney's fees, which covered most of what I had spent. The HOA also agreed to amend the covenants to clarify the community harmony clause and make clear that it could not be used to override specific provisions that allowed certain structures or activities. Karen's criminal case was another matter. She hired a defense attorney who tried to argue that she had been under extreme emotional distress and that her actions were out of character. The prosecutor was not sympathetic. Karen had destroyed someone else's property in a calculated manner during daylight hours with premeditation. She eventually pleaded guilty to criminal mischief in exchange for the charge being reduced to a misdemeanor. She was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 100 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution for the fence damage plus court costs. She also had to undergo anger management counseling. The fallout continued for months. Karen resigned from the Architectural Review Committee in disgrace. She and Donald put their house on the market in May and moved out by June. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they relocated to Tucson, where presumably no one knew about her arrest and conviction. Patricia also decided to move. She claimed it was because she was downsizing, but everyone knew the real reason. She had lost her position of power, and she could not stand living in a neighborhood where people knew she had abused her authority. The new HOA board turned out to be excellent. George Patterson served as president and ran meetings efficiently and fairly. Susan Ramirez made sure all enforcement actions were properly documented and legally sound. Tom Fletcher discovered that the previous board had been mismanaging funds, spending HOA money on unnecessary expenses like fancy dinners that were allegedly board meetings. He filed a formal complaint, and there was an audit. The audit revealed that over the previous 3 years, Patricia had spent nearly $15,000 in HOA funds on questionable expenses. The HOA considered pursuing legal action against her, but ultimately decided it was not worth the cost and hassle since she was already gone. My fence remained standing, of course. I spent many peaceful evenings in my backyard that spring and summer, enjoying the privacy I had fought so hard to secure. Several other neighbors installed similar fences over the following year, and the new board approved all of them without issue. The neighborhood felt different, lighter somehow. People were not walking around afraid of arbitrary enforcement actions or petty complaints from busybodies with too much time on their hands. In August, about 9 months after the whole ordeal began, I was sitting in my backyard with a beer, watching the sunset over my very intentional privacy fence when my doorbell rang. I walked around to the front and found Susan Ramirez standing there with a plate of cookies. "Hey, Quincy," she said with a smile. "I wanted to thank you properly for everything you did. If you had not stood up to Patricia and Karen, the rest of us might never have found the courage to make a change. You really did this whole neighborhood a favor." I accepted the cookies and invited her to sit in the backyard for a bit. We talked about how much the neighborhood had changed, how the new board was working on creating actual community events that people enjoyed instead of just enforcement actions, and how property values had actually increased despite Patricia's dire predictions that my fence would destroy them. As Susan left, she mentioned that the board was considering giving me an award at the annual meeting for community service and standing up for homeowner rights. I never did get that award because I declined the nomination. I did not fight the fence battle for recognition. I fought it because it was the right thing to do, and because backing down to bullies and petty tyrants only encourages them. But the real victory was not the lawsuit or the board election, or even keeping my fence. The real victory was that the neighborhood became a place where people felt safe in their own homes, where rules were applied fairly and consistently, and where HOA leadership served the community instead of using it as a personal power trip. The experience taught me several important lessons. First, documentation is everything. Without my photos, property surveys, written communication, and especially those security camera videos, I would have had a much harder time proving my case. Second, you are rarely alone in dealing with a bully. There were dozens of other homeowners who had been mistreated by Patricia and Karen over the years, and once I started organizing, they were eager to join the cause. Third, sometimes you have to spend money to fight for your rights. The legal fees were significant, but they were worth it to establish the principle that HOA boards cannot simply ignore their own rules to satisfy personal vendettas. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, HOA boards only have as much power as homeowners give them. For years, Patricia had dominated the neighborhood because nobody bothered to vote in elections or challenge her decisions. Once people became engaged and participated in the democratic process, her power evaporated instantly. That is a lesson that applies far beyond HOA politics. I still live in that house on Saguaro Ridge Drive. The fence is still standing, weathered now by a few years of Arizona sun, but still solid and still providing the privacy I wanted. I serve on the Architectural Review Committee now, having been appointed by the board last year. I make sure that we interpret the rules fairly and consistently, and that we approve reasonable requests from homeowners who just want to enjoy their properties. I never want anyone else to go through what I went through. Every now and then, someone new moves into the neighborhood and asks about HOA rules for fences or other improvements. I always tell them the same thing. Read the covenants carefully, document everything, and don't be afraid to stand up for your rights. I also tell them the story of Karen and Patricia, as a cautionary tale about what can happen when HOA boards lose sight of their purpose and start treating their position as personal fiefdoms. Last month, I ran into Donald Whitmore, Karen's ex-husband, at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix. He had apparently divorced Karen about a year after they moved to Tucson, citing irreconcilable differences. He apologized to me for his part in the fence vandalism and told me that living with Karen's constant anger and need for control had been exhausting. He seemed like a different person, more relaxed and at peace. I told him I held no grudge and wished him well. It was a strange closure to that chapter. The neighborhood continues to thrive. Property values have increased by about 12% since the board changeover, which is slightly above the area average. The new board has organized community events like food truck nights, holiday parties, and a neighborhood yard sale. People actually know their neighbors now and talk to each other in friendly ways rather than eyeing each other suspiciously, wondering who might file a complaint. It turns out that when an HOA focuses on building community instead of enforcing petty rules, everyone benefits. My backyard has become something of a neighborhood gathering spot. The privacy fence, ironically, makes people feel more comfortable visiting because they are not worried about being watched or judged. I have hosted barbecues, game nights, and informal get-togethers with neighbors who have become genuine friends. George Patterson comes over every other week to watch basketball games. Susan Ramirez and her husband join me for occasional dinners. Tom Fletcher and I have started a tradition of smoking brisket together on summer weekends. The whole experience also changed how I think about community involvement. Before the fence incident, I was one of those people who just wanted to be left alone, who did not want to deal with HOA politics or neighborhood drama. I have learned that staying disengaged and hoping problems will go away is not a viable strategy. If you want to live in a functional community with reasonable governance, you have to be willing to participate and speak up when things go wrong. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had just taken down the fence when Patricia first demanded it. I would have been out $8,000 for the installation, and I still would not have the privacy I wanted. More importantly, Patricia would have continued her reign of petty tyranny, and Karen would have continued filing vindictive complaints against anyone who annoyed her. The neighborhood would have remained a place where people were afraid to make improvements to their own properties for fear of arbitrary enforcement actions. Instead, by standing firm and fighting back, I helped create a positive change that benefited everyone. That is not to say I am some kind of hero. I was just a guy who wanted a fence and was willing to stand up for his legal rights. But sometimes, that is all it takes to make a difference. One person willing to say no to unreasonable demands and yes to following the actual rules as written. The legal reforms the new board implemented have made a real difference. The Community Harmony Clause can now only be invoked in cases of genuine nuisance activities like excessive noise, dangerous conditions, or illegal behavior. It cannot be used to override specific provisions of the covenants. The board also established a formal appeals process where any homeowner cited for a violation can request a hearing before the full board and present evidence in their defense. Board members who have personal conflicts with a homeowner must recuse themselves from decisions affecting that homeowner. These might seem like obvious, common-sense reforms, but they were revolutionary for our neighborhood. They transformed the HOA from an adversarial enforcement body into something closer to what it was supposed to be. A democratically elected group of neighbors working together to maintain property values and community standards while respecting individual property rights. I have also become something of an informal advisor to people in other neighborhoods dealing with similar HOA problems. Through the Facebook group I created, which has expanded to include people from all over the Phoenix metro area, I have helped probably 24 homeowners navigate disputes with their HOAs. The most important advice I give is always the same. Know your rights, document everything, and do not be afraid to push back when the HOA is clearly in the wrong. One case I helped with involved a woman whose HOA was trying to force her to remove solar panels from her roof. Arizona has specific laws protecting the right to install solar panels, but her HOA was claiming the panels violated aesthetic standards. I connected her with Robert Chen, who sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA citing the state statutes. The HOA backed down immediately once they realized they were on the wrong side of the law. That homeowner is now saving hundreds of dollars a month on electricity, all because she was willing to fight back instead of meekly complying with an illegal demand. Another case involved a veteran who was being fined for displaying an American flag. Federal law protects the right to display the flag, but again, the HOA was claiming it violated their rules. A simple letter citing the relevant federal statute resolved that situation. These cases reinforced my belief that many HOA boards either do not know or do not care about the actual laws governing their authority, and they rely on homeowners being too intimidated or too uninformed to challenge them. As I sit here now, more than 2 years after the fence battle began, I can honestly say it was one of the most stressful but ultimately rewarding experiences of my life. I learned that I am capable of standing up for myself in ways I had not fully realized. I learned that community matters and that positive change is possible when people work together. I learned that bullies, whether they are schoolyard thugs or HOA board presidents, back down when confronted with determination and facts. My 6-foot cedar fence still stands as a monument to the principle that homeowners have rights that cannot be trampled by petty bureaucrats with delusions of authority. Every time I sit in my backyard, enjoying my privacy and my view of my own property, I remember the fight it took to secure that simple pleasure. And every time a neighbor installs a similar fence without harassment from the HOA, I feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that my battle made their lives a little bit easier. Karen Whitmore never did have a legal view easement. That fact was clear from the beginning, and it remained clear throughout the entire conflict. The mountains she wanted to see are still there, visible from dozens of public locations, and from properties that actually face them directly. What she wanted was not a reasonable protection of an established legal right, but rather an unreasonable demand that I sacrifice my privacy for her aesthetic preference. The HOA's decision to back her demand, instead of following their own written rules, was an abuse of authority, plain and simple. The legal system, for all its flaws and expenses, ultimately worked the way it was supposed to. My lawsuit forced the HOA to confront the fact that they had no legal basis for their demands. Karen's criminal prosecution held her accountable for taking her frustration beyond complaints into actual destruction of property. The democratic process allowed the homeowners to replace a dysfunctional board with competent leadership. These systems are not perfect, but they provided avenues for justice that might not exist in other contexts. I have thought a lot about why Patricia and Karen behaved the way they did. Part of it was clearly personal friendship, with Patricia using her position to help her friend get what she wanted. Part of it was probably a sense of entitlement, with Karen believing that her 12 years in the neighborhood gave her some kind of priority over newer residents. Part of it might have been simple power tripping, with Patricia enjoying the ability to make demands and have people comply. Whatever the psychological motivations, the result was a clear abuse of the authority entrusted to HOA leadership. The experience has also made me much more skeptical of HOAs in general. I understand their purpose in maintaining property values and preventing truly problematic behavior, but I have seen firsthand how easily they can become tools of oppression in the hands of the wrong people. If I ever move to a different property, I will think long and hard before choosing a neighborhood with an HOA. And if I do choose one, I will be actively involved in governance from day one to help prevent the kind of abuse I experienced. For now, though, I am happy where I am. The neighborhood has become a genuinely pleasant place to live. The HOA functions the way it should, handling necessary maintenance and enforcing reasonable standards without harassing homeowners over trivial matters. The community feels like an actual community, with neighbors who know and support each other. And my fence, the beautiful cedar privacy fence that started this whole saga, continues to do exactly what I built it to do. Give me a private space where I can relax and enjoy my own property without feeling like I am on display. The story of my fence battle has become something of a legend in the neighborhood. New residents hear about it and often come by to see the infamous fence that sparked such drama. I always laugh and tell them it is just a fence, nothing special about it except that it represents the principle that homeowners have rights and that those rights matter. Some people get it immediately. Others seem puzzled that anyone would go to such lengths over a fence. Those are usually the people who have never had to fight for something they believed was right in the face of institutional opposition. Looking back on everything that happened, I would not change my decisions. Fighting back was the right choice, even though it was expensive, stressful, and time-consuming. Some battles are worth fighting not because of the specific outcome, but because of the principles at stake. This was one of those battles. The fence was always legal, the HOA was always wrong, and standing up to them was always the right thing to do, and in the end, justice prevailed. Karen faced criminal consequences for her actions. Patricia lost her position of power. The neighborhood got better leadership. And I got to keep my fence. Sometimes, when you stand up for what is right and refuse to back down, things actually work out the way they should. That is a lesson worth remembering. Whether you are dealing with HOA drama, workplace conflicts, or any other situation where someone with a little bit of authority tries to push you around. My fence blocks Karen's view. She has no legal view easement. Those two simple facts were always the beginning and end of the matter, no matter how much Patricia tried to complicate things with vague appeals to community harmony. And now, more than 2 years later, the fence still stands. The mountains are still there, and Karen is someone else's problem in Tucson. I call that a happy ending.